Chapter 1. The man who sat to stilt was on a sharp February morning, the kind that dresses London in a coat of brittle frost and sets cab wheels squealing upon the icy cobbles, when the curious case of Mr. Benedict Swain first reached the ears of my remarkable friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. We had spent the better part of the morning in our sitting room at 2-1B Baker Street. Holmes stretched languidly upon the divan, with a monograph on Burmese poisons in his lap, while I had been endeavoring to finish a dispatch for the Lancet that had long demanded my attention. The fire was stoked, the scent of strong tea hung in the air, and silence reigned, save for the occasional rustle of the newspaper or the soft clink of Holmes' pipe against the ashtray. It was then that Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a card on a small silver tray. Holmes took it without a glance and passed it to me. Mr. Felix Ridley, solicitor, Ridley and Co. Lambeth. Show him up, Holmes said, already rising from his place. I take it, Watson, that we are about to be plunged into a matter of legal unease rather than criminal enterprise. Moments later, Mr. Ridley appeared, a man of wiry build, greying sideburns, and an anxious air that did not sit well with his otherwise polished demeanor. He removed his gloves and hat mechanically, his eyes darting about the room as though searching for certainty in the gaslight shadows. I do beg your pardon for calling unannounced, Mr. Holmes, he began, his voice tight with tension, but I believe I am in need of your singular faculties. I represent the interests of the Swain family specifically, a Mr. Benedict Swain, a retired academic residing in Chislehurst. It is a matter most peculiar. Holmes gestured to the chair opposite the hearth. Please, begin at the beginning, if you would. Ridley seated himself stiffly and leaned forward, the firelight catching the tremor in his hands. Mr. Swain is a recluse, a bachelor of 72 years, formerly a lecturer in classical antiquities at King's College. He inherited a modest estate some years ago and retired to a secluded house near the common. He has no family, no living siblings or children, only the housekeeper, Mrs. Forbes, who has tended to him for nearly a decade. Go on, said Holmes, steepling his fingers. Well, it began 3 weeks ago. Mr. Swain ceased all communication. Letters were unanswered. The housekeeper reported that he had taken to sitting for hours entire days without speaking or moving. He refused meals, refused light. She described it as though he were waiting for something. And you believe he is in danger? I cannot say for certain. That is precisely why I come to you. There has been no overt act of violence, no crime as such, but something is amiss, deeply amiss. Holmes' eyes glinted. A man who withdraws into silence and stillness is often listening for sounds others cannot hear, or watching for things others do not see. Ridley blinked. I beg your pardon. I accept your case, Mr. Ridley, Holmes said. Watson and I shall accompany you to Chislehurst this afternoon. Please make arrangements to collect us by 1 o'clock. The solicitor stood, visibly relieved. You have no idea how grateful I am, gentlemen. When the door had closed behind him, I turned to Holmes. Surely the poor fellow is merely unwell struck with melancholia or some senile affliction. Holmes struck a match and relit his pipe. If that were all, Watson, he would have been carted off to St. Bartholomew's. But Ridley is not a man prone to hysteria. He is frightened by something he cannot articulate. I suspect that stillness may be the quietest scream of all. The carriage ride to Chislehurst took just under 2 hours, and the winter countryside unfolded outside our window in sombre grey and frostbitten green. As we approached the Swain estate, an ivy-clad Georgian house, modest in proportion yet isolated enough to encourage introspection, I noted the silence that fell over our party. Even Ridley, who had made several unsuccessful attempts at conversation. Mrs. Forbes met us at the door, a square-shouldered woman in her 50s, with the kind of restrained grief one associates with nurses and loyal servants. I'll take you to him, Mr. Holmes, but I don't expect you'll get much from him. He hasn't spoken a word since last Wednesday. She led us through a corridor lined with bookshelves and strange Roman statuary until we came to a drawing room where all the curtains had been drawn. A fire crackled low in the grate, but otherwise the room was swathed in heavy shadow. And there he was. Benedict Swain sat in a high-backed armchair by the window, his posture rigid, hands clasped upon his knees, eyes unfocused. His white beard and long fingers gave him the appearance of a saint in some medieval triptych immobile, ancient and impenetrable. Holmes approached with deliberate quiet. observing the man with an intensity that prickled even my skin. He paced once around the chair, crouched to study the floorboards, then addressed the housekeeper. "How long has he remained thus?" "Since the night of the frost," she said. "I found him like this the next morning. I thought he'd died with his eyes open, but he's alive, breathing, eating when I insist. But he doesn't move unless I force him to." Holmes leaned closer. "Mr. Swain, I am Sherlock Holmes. I've come to speak with you. If you can hear me, blink once." There was no response. Holmes straightened and turned to the fireplace, eyeing the mantel. "Watson, what do you make of the hearth?" I stepped closer. The ash had been swept recently, too recently, considering the fire was low, and among the logs was a sliver of scorched parchment, almost deliberately placed. Holmes plucked it out with tongs and handed it to me. It was part of a page torn from a book-laden script, singed at the edges. Only 3 words remained legible: Stabant, Hormans, Mutati. The men stood transformed. I translated aloud. A reference to Ovid. Holmes smiled faintly. Possibly. But transformed by what, I wonder? He turned again to Swain. "This man is not mad, nor is he broken. He is hiding in plain sight, and I intend to find out what from." Chapter 2. The solicitor's doubt. The room had grown unnervingly still once more, the fire whispering in the grate, casting flickering shadows along the lined face of Benedict Swain, who remained frozen in his chair like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Holmes paced once more around the figure, his expression unreadable. "He sees," Holmes muttered under his breath, "but he does not look. He hears, but does not listen. A man waiting, not hiding, not remained near the hearth, the scrap of burnt parchment still resting in my hand like a puzzle box that refused to open." Holmes gave no further commentary on it. Instead, he turned sharply to Mrs. Forbes. "Madam, may I see the remainder of Mr. Swain's library? I presume this was not the only volume to find its way into the fire." Mrs. Forbes looked hesitant. "His study's locked. He began keeping it so last spring. Only he has the key." Holmes turned to Ridley. "And you've never been granted access?" "No," the solicitor admitted. "He was always meticulous about his privacy, particularly when it came to his classical research." Holmes raised a brow. "Mr. Swain has a fixation with comparative mythology, ancient transformation cults, and Roman mystery religions. He once wrote a monograph on Mithric symbolism and the rites of stillness. It was rejected by the Academy, I believe, but he kept working privately." Holmes made no reply to this, but I saw the tightening of his mouth and knew he had filed the detail away with interest. He pivoted toward the housekeeper. "Mrs. Forbes, if you would be so kind as to bring us a pot of tea and, if possible, a list of anyone who has visited Mr. Swain in the last 2 months." "I haven't been any," she said quickly. "None besides Mr. Ridley, the postman, and perhaps the groundsman, but he never came inside." Nevertheless, she gave a short nod and disappeared through the doorway, leaving us in the half-lit room with the silent academic and the solicitous Mr. Ridley, who had begun to fidget with his gloves. "You said you've known Mr. Swain for many years?" Holmes asked, settling into the wingback opposite the frozen figure. "Professionally, yes," Ridley replied. "We handled the final disbursement of his brother's estate, some 10 years past. Since then, I've seen him perhaps twice a year, once to update his will, and another time when he briefly considered selling the house. But something has changed recently." "Yes, dramatically so. It's not just the silence or the manner of it, as though he were calculating, listening to a voice I cannot hear." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Did he express any fear, mention any threats?" "No, none. But he did once say, this was months ago. Mind you that stillness is the only protection now. I assumed it was poetic eccentricity." Holmes' eyes flickered toward me and back again. "And yet you came to Baker Street." "Why, I found a letter in his study drawer, one of the few he left unlocked. I confess, I opened it out of concern. It was unsigned. All it said was, 'It begins again on the feast of February. Be still.'" A shiver passed over me, though I could not say why. "Did you bring the letter?" "I did." Ridley pulled an envelope from his breast pocket and handed it to Holmes. The letter was indeed as described, typed, unsigned, and bearing no watermark or insignia, just the cryptic sentence. Holmes turned it over carefully, sniffed it once, and held it to the firelight. "Nothing remarkable on the surface," he murmured. though I detect a faint odor. Cedar oil, perhaps, a preservative used in manuscript restoration. Tell me, Ridley, did Mr. Swain have dealings with any libraries or antiquities dealers? I believe he once corresponded with a Professor Meldrum at the British Museum, but that was years ago. Holmes tucked the letter into his notebook and rose. I must see the study. As I said, Ridley replied cautiously, it's locked. He kept the key on a chain around his neck. Holmes turned back toward Swain's still form. Then I shall ask him for it. Before I could object, Holmes knelt gently at the man's side and leaned in close to his ear. Mr. Swain, I need your key. I believe you wish for me to see what's inside that room. If you do, blink once. Again, there was no movement. But then, Holmes reached down to look catly, as one might disarm a trap, and drew out the thin chain that hung beneath Swain's collar. There, at the end, was a small brass key. I believe that constitutes consent, Holmes said dryly, and turned to go. Ridley hesitated. Are you certain we should? I do not break locks where keys are offered, Holmes interrupted. Besides, I believe Mr. Swain wants very much to be understood, even if he cannot speak. We followed him down the corridor, past shelves sagging under the weight of leather-bound tomes, until we reached a heavy door of dark-stained oak. Holmes inserted the key and turned it with care. The door creaked open, and a musty and closed scent wafted out, a mingling of old paper, dust, and something less identifiable, something like copper and stone. The room beyond was bathed in half-light from a single dust-blind window. Stacks of books rose like spires on every surface. A desk littered with ancient coins, scraps of scrollwork, and candles stood at the center. On the wall above it hung a peculiar mosaic circular, depicting a man surrounded by animals, each turned inward with blank, silver eyes. Holmes surveyed it all in silence. Then, very gently, he reached out and touched the edge of the desk. His fingers came away coated in the faint residue of wax and something darker. What do you see, Holmes? I asked quietly. He held up a small object. It was a stylus made of ivory, but the end had been scorched, blackened, as if recently thrust into flame. This was used, he murmured, recently, and yet no one has been in here. I moved to the window. Outside lay the snow-dusted garden, and beyond that, the empty wood. It feels, I said, like something ended in here. Holmes gave me a look sharp appraising. Or something began. Behind us, Ridley had gone pale. I don't know what any of this means, he stammered. That makes two of us, I said. Holmes remained still, eyes locked on the mosaic. Then he spoke, voice low. February is the Roman festival of purification. It precedes the rites of Lupercalia, but purification from what, I wonder? He turned, striding toward the door. We shall remain here tonight. I have no doubt this house will speak to us. The question, Watson, is whether we shall understand what it says before it's too late. Chapter 3. A scene of deception. The decision to remain at the Swain estate overnight was not one I relished. The house, with its cold stone floors and watchful shadows, exuded a kind of latent dread as though it had been holding its breath for weeks and now exhaled in long, silent draughts. Still, Holmes had made up his mind, and once that was done, there was little point in objection. Mrs. Forbes, though visibly uncomfortable, arranged a pair of guest rooms and lit additional lamps in the hallways. By late evening, Ridley had excused himself with a strained apology, claiming an early meeting the following morning. I suspected the atmosphere of the place had begun to fray his nerves, as it had mine. Holmes, on the other hand, was in his element. I found him seated at the desk in the study, long after supper, poring over the books and objects we had uncovered. The choice of material, he murmured, tapping a volume with his knuckle, is telling. Lucan, Apuleius, Ovid, madness, and rites of passage through silence. I glanced at one of the pages he had marked. It was covered in annotations, inked notations, in a hand that I assumed was Mr. Swain's. Several were marginal remarks in Latin, cryptic and fragmented. One phrase had been underlined twice. Tacitus observit, mutus defenditur. He watches in silence, defended by muteness. Holmes looked up. Watson, would you join me for a brief walk? I find that puzzle pieces are often stirred loose in the presence of cold air and darkness. I had little desire to go wandering through Swain's property at such an hour, but Holmes had already donned his Inverness cape and was fastening the toggles with precise deliberation. I sighed and retrieved my overcoat. The night was bitter, and the moon had vanished behind a bank of clouds, rendering the sky a void. Holmes carried a lantern, its glow swaying across the ground like a pendulum. We passed the hedgerow and made our way along the narrow path that skirted the rear of the house, toward the grove of bare trees that fringed the estate. "This place is old," Holmes said softly, "older than the house that sits upon it. There is an echo beneath the land, Watson. Do you feel it?" I did not answer. The frost crunched beneath our boots, and the wind whispered between the branches above us like a warning. We reached the edge of the wood, where the garden ended and the wild began. Holmes raised the lantern and crouched low, his eyes scanning the ground. "Observe," he said, "footprints, more than one set, and here note the pattern. Not boots, not shoes." I knelt beside him. The prints were faint, softened by wind, but visible. Bare feet, thin, long, and angled strangely. Human in shape, but something about the proportions struck me as wrong. Holmes stood. No sane man walks barefoot through frozen woods at midnight, unless of course he is compelled. Compelled by what? I asked. "Let us hope we do not find out tonight." He continued forward, passing through a break in the hedgerow, until we reached a small clearing. A ring of flat earth circled by stones. In the center stood a single iron pedestal, waist high, on which rested a burned-out candle. "No wind could have lit that," Holmes said, "and Mrs. Forbes claims no one entered the study. Yet the wax matches the remnants we found. There, you think Swain came here? I think someone did, and they wanted to be unseen." I peered around the clearing. "Holmes, this place feels wrong," he supplied, with a grim smile. "Yes, I felt it too." Suddenly, he straightened, quickly, back to the house. He turned on his heel and strode back along the path, faster than before. I hurried after him, heart thudding in my chest. We reached the back door, re-entered through the scullery, and moved silently through the darkened halls. The study door was ajar. Holmes raised a hand, halting me. Then he pushed the door fully open. The room was empty, and Benedict Swain's key was gone. We searched the room, but there was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken objects. The mosaic still hung above the desk, its eerie figures frozen in their watchful spiral. Holmes examined the floor and turned up. Nothing but the faint imprint of slippered feet leading to the door and disappearing beyond. "I locked that door behind us," I said, a chill spreading through me. "As did I," Holmes murmured, "but keys have a way of finding other locks." We checked the chair where Swain had sat, unmoving only hours before. It too was empty. Mrs. Forbes was roused. She was incredulous at first, then shaken to the core. He couldn't have left. He never leaves, not even to the front steps. And yet, Holmes said, he has done precisely that. "Tell me, Mrs. Forbes, did he ever speak of dreams, or voices?" She hesitated. "He used to talk in his sleep, whispering things, names I didn't recognize. Sometimes I'd hear him calling out, over and over, 'I see them. I see them in the stillness.'" Holmes nodded grimly. "Watson, gather your revolver. Tonight, we search the grounds again. But this time, we do not walk, we listen." "For what?" He looked toward the study door, his voice quiet, for silence. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects the following morning broke pale and bitter. The sky a washed-out canvas streaked with ash-blue clouds. A light dusting of snow had settled over the grounds during the night, masking all footprints from the previous evening, including those of the vanished Benedict Swain. Holmes stood at the edge of the clearing where the iron pedestal sat, his eyes flicking rapidly across the scene. He said nothing, but I knew from the rigidity of his stance that something had shifted behind his calm faculty. We had searched long into the night with lanterns and muffled boots, calling Swain's name across the hedgerows and woods, but no sin had been found, no new footprints, no answer in the shadows. The iron pedestal remained undisturbed, the candle cold, and the silence Holmes had spoken of. It clung to everything, thick and close, like breath behind a closed door. "I do not believe Swain left this property," Holmes said quietly. I turned to him. "Then where is he?" "That is what we must determine. But first, Watson, I should like to know more about the people who surround him. Those who see him not often, perhaps, but closely enough to matter." "You mean Mrs. Forbes and Mr. Ridley, and, if my suspicions are correct, at least one more soul who has yet to step into the light." He turned back toward the house. "Come, it is time we brought our suspects into the drawing room." By noon, we had reconvened in the main parlor of the house. Holmes had insisted on a formal arrangement, 3 chairs drawn into a half-circle before the hearth. The fire stoked high, windows flung open despite the cold. Mrs. Forbes sat stiffly on the left, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Felix Ridley arrived shortly after, summoned by telegram, his brow furrowed and lips drawn thin. The third chair remained conspicuously empty. "You expect someone else?" Ridley asked after a pause. "I do," Holmes replied, pacing before the fireplace, "but they may require encouragement." Mrs. Forbes glanced anxiously toward the door. "Mr. Holmes, what exactly are you suggesting? That someone's hiding in this house?" Holmes did not answer her directly. Instead, he turned to Ridley. "You've known Mr. Swain for over a decade, and yet you claim never to have met a single visitor beyond his housekeeper." Ridley hesitated. "Yes, well, that is to say, I never encountered anyone during my brief visits, but it's possible he corresponded with others. His mailbox was often full." "Indeed," Holmes said, "and yet there are no outgoing letters of late, no drafts, no pens inked, a curious absence for a man once consumed with scholarship." He crossed the room to a side table and retrieved a sheet of paper, one of the annotations from Swain's study. "Do either of you recognize this handwriting?" Ridley and Forbes both peered at the page and shook their heads. "It's not his," Mrs. Forbes said. "He wrote with a finer hand." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "This belongs to someone else, someone who had access to his private study." "But who?" I asked. "That," Holmes said, "is what we are about to determine." At that moment, there came a knock at the door. Holmes went to answer it himself. A tall young man in his 20s stepped inside, shoulders hunched, beneath a long brown coat. His eyes darted nervously about the room. His hair was unruly, and his fingers stained with ink. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked in a cautious voice. Holmes inclined his head. "Mr. Julian Elcott, I presume?" The young man blinked in surprise. "How did you? Your boots are muddy from the northern lane, the only road not salted this morning. Your right cuff bears ash from the study's hearth, and you left a half-finished note in the upper desk drawer addressed to Dr. B.S. Your presence in this house is not a deduction, it is an inevitability." Elcott swallowed hard. "I didn't mean any harm." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "You will find that confession is far less painful than subterfuge. Please, tell us your connection to Mr. Swain." Julian sat down slowly, eyes flitting between the others. "I was his student, briefly. At King's he was already retiring by the time I entered my second year, but he agreed to supervise my private work. I was fascinated by the same obscure subjects, cult practices, syncretic belief systems, archaic transformation rites. He took me under his wing." "Did you continue corresponding after his retirement?" Holmes asked. "Yes, he invited me here once, 2 months ago. Said he had something to show me, something important." "What was it?" Julian hesitated. "He called it the convergence. He wouldn't explain it. Just said that soon the stillness would open. I thought he was slipping into mysticism, but you came back last week. I was worried. He'd sent a letter, it was strange, fragmented. I came without telling anyone. He let me in, barely spoke. He just pointed to a passage in a book, then walked out of the room. I stayed in the guest quarters. I left the next morning." Holmes leaned in. "Did you see or hear anything during your visit that struck you as unusual?" Julian nodded. "At night, I heard movement from the study, but not from Swain. Someone else was in there, whispering and laughing." Ridley scoffed. "You expect us to believe that?" Holmes turned sharply. "We are not here to believe, we are here to listen." He looked back at Julian. "One last question. Did Mr. Swain ever mention a Nama Latin name, perhaps associated with these rites?" Julian's brow furrowed. "Yes, he called it Stator. Said it was the god who holds men in place, who stills the foot that runs, the hand that strikes, the tongue that lies." Holmes said nothing, but I saw the faintest tightening around his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Elcott," he said at last. "You've been most helpful." As the young man departed, Holmes turned back to the others. "There are no more strangers in this house," he said. "Only truths we have yet to confront." He looked at each of us in turn. Mr. Swain was not simply a man who withdrew from the world. He was enacting a ritual of stillness, one both ancient and deliberate, and someone here knew exactly what that ritual would invite. Chapter 5. The first suspect. Despite the fire's warmth and the snow softening against the window panes, a chill lingered in the drawing room that had nothing to do with the weather. Julian Elcott had departed in silence, leaving behind the strange weight of half-confessions and academic obsession. Mrs. Forbes had excused herself to the kitchen, murmuring something about checking the pantry, though I suspected it was merely an excuse to leave the atmosphere Holmes had conjured so deliberately. Felix Ridley remained, seated upright, lips pursed as though sucking on some bitter fruit. Holmes stood by the hearth, one arm folded across his chest, the other bent upward to support his chin. His familiar posture went deep in contemplation. "You seem troubled, Mr. Ridley," Holmes said without lifting his gaze from the flames. "I am," the solicitor replied tersely. "This entire business has spiraled beyond reason. Whispering in studies, barefoot prints in snow, and now you speak of rituals as though we've wandered into a tale by Poe." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but even Poe began with the facts." Ridley bristled. "You've no right to imply I've implied nothing," Holmes cut in smoothly. "Though you've raised an interesting point. Would you be so kind, Mr. Ridley, as to remind me of the time you first visited this house after Mr. Swain fell into his silence?" Ridley narrowed his eyes. "Roughly 3 weeks ago, as I stated before." "Indeed, and you claim that during that visit you were alarmed by his condition?" "Yes, of course." Holmes turned. "Then tell me, why did you wait another 2 weeks before contacting me?" The silence that followed was so complete it seemed even the house listened. Ridley's nostrils flared. "It was not an easy decision. I thought it a medical matter, not criminal." Holmes stepped closer. "And yet you suspected danger. You admitted as much when you visited Baker Street. You mentioned a letter." Ridley's jaw tightened. "May I see the envelope again?" Holmes asked casually. The solicitor hesitated, then reached into his coat and withdrew the cream-colored envelope with the typed message Holmes had examined the day before. "Thank you." Holmes took it delicately, held it to the light, then stepped toward the writing desk and retrieved a small vial from his satchel. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he brushed the corner of the envelope with a thin reagent. A faint shimmer appeared, then vanished. He turned back to us. "Mr. Ridley, this envelope was typed on a Remington Model 6, likely manufactured between 1896 and 1902. You'll be interested to know that the British Museum where Julian L. mentor, Professor Meldrum, once worked as a different make entirely for their correspondence. But there is only one Remington Model 6 I know of, still in service in this part of Kent." He tapped a corner of the envelope. "The one in your office, Ridley and Co. Lambeth." Ridley's face drained of color. "That's absurd." "Is it? You claim the letter was found among Mr. Swain's effects, but the envelope bears no dust, no sign of age, and more importantly, the ink used is not one commonly stopped except, curiously enough, by legal firms that still use ledger. Carbon. Coincidence? Is it also coincidence that you delayed contacting me until the Feast of February approached, an event referenced explicitly in the message, or that you have visited this house more often than you claimed?" Ridley surged to his feet. "How dare you?" "I dare because the facts require it," Holmes replied coolly. 3 weeks ago, you came here and found Mr. Swain already in his state of unnatural stillness. But I suspect it was not your first visit that month. In fact, I suspect you were here 2 nights earlier. That's a lie, is it? Then explain the soot on your cuffs when you arrived yesterday. Soot. That matches the residue in the study fireplace. Or shall I summon a constable to compare the samples? I rose instinctively, unsure whether to intervene. Ridley stood frozen, caught between fury and fear. "Mr. Ridley," Holmes said, voice now low and measured, "what happened here on the night of February the 1st? Ridley sank slowly back into his chair. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "I didn't mean for anything to happen," he said quietly. "I swear to you." "Then speak." Ridley exhaled shakily. "He asked me to come. Benedict, he wrote to me in early January, said he was on the cusp of something, a breakthrough. He wanted me here as a witness, said I was the only one he trusted." Holmes said nothing, waiting. "I came that night. He'd lit candles all through the study. The curtains were drawn. He'd chalked symbols on the floor, Latin, inscriptions I couldn't understand. He was chanting something, low, rhythmic. Then he turned to me and said, 'It is almost time. You must promise not to move, not to speak, no matter what you see.' And did you obey?" Ridley nodded. "I did, at least at first. But then he began to change." "Change?" I asked. "Not in form," Ridley whispered. "In stillness." He stopped breathing. "Watson." His eyes were open, but there was no breath, no flicker of life. And then there was a sound. He swallowed. A sound. Holmes prompted, like wind through a tunnel, but there was no wind, just the flame guttering, then going out. I ran. I didn't know what else to do. And the letter, I wrote it a week later. I thought, if I warned him, maybe he'd stop, or maybe it would buy time. Holmes regarded him in silence. Then, without a word, crossed to the desk and jotted a brief note. He handed it to me. Please see this delivered to Inspector Gregson at Scotland Yard, he said. We'll need a man posted at the estate gate. No one enters or leaves without my knowledge. What are you expecting? I asked Holmes. Gaze returned to the fireplace. A man cannot vanish without either a place to go or a reason to be gone. I intend to find both. Chapter 6. The secret Cluth afternoon passed in hushed activity. Holmes instructed Mrs. Forbes to remain within the main quarters of the house and to avoid the study entirely. Ridley, pale and subdued after his confession, was kept under informal watch. Watson's suggestion, tactfully posed as companionship rather than suspicion. As for Holmes himself, he withdrew into the study, locking the door behind him. It was nearly an hour later when I found him still there, kneeling near the fireplace, surrounded by books and ash. You're looking for something specific, I said from the doorway. Not something, Holmes replied, his voice low and clipped, but the absence of something, and I've just found it. I stepped inside, cautiously. The study had taken on a strange quality in the afternoon light. The frost outside had melted just enough to smear the windows, diffusing the daylight into a pallid haze. On the desk lay Swain's annotated texts, Elcott's letter fragments. The stylus Holmes had previously examined, and now beside it a single brass candlestick, half melted, its wax a curious amber. Observe, Watson, Holmes said, tapping the candlestick. This is not one of the standard fixtures in this house. The other holders, as you've seen, are iron, simple and functional. This, however, is older, ornate, engraved. I bent down. The pattern was faint but distinct, serpents coiled around a tree, flanked by wings, a Mithraic symbol. I asked. Precisely. Found often in temple bas-reliefs. And note the wax. It's darker, not merely darker, scented, resinous, burned with a specific purpose. This is ritual wax, made from labdanum and cedar, used in certain ancient rites for inducing trance or more relevantly purification. I stood back, uneasy. You think Swain used it here, or someone else lit it here, on this very floor? Yet Mrs. Forbes claims no knowledge of it, and Ridley made no mention of this candlestick when describing the night of February the 1st. Curious, don't you think? Holmes rose and retrieved a small brush from his pocket. He swept delicately across the edge of the desk, collecting minute flakes from the surface. These, he said, are traces of bone ash, another ritual component. My brow furrowed. It still doesn't prove Ridley was lying. Holmes turned. Not lying entirely, no, but omitting. And it is in the omissions, Watson, where the truth most often hides. He opened the top drawer of the desk. Inside were parchment scraps and a folded cloth. From beneath the cloth, Holmes drew out a thin leather-bound notebook. Ridley claimed Swain had stopped writing. Yet here is his private journal. I moved closer. The pages were filled in a hurried hand Latin fragments, invocations, occasional English notations. The final entry was in Latin but underlined twice. Stata tangit, vocem tollit, oculus mane, stata touches. He removes the voice. The eye remains. I translated slowly. What does that mean? Whatever it is, I believe Mr. Swain was preparing for it, Holmes replied. He feared it, yes, but also welcomed it. The stillness was not merely a symptom. It was the aim. He snapped the journal shut. There is one more detail, Watson, one I missed before. Holmes crossed to the armchair where Swain had been found. He knelt beside the upholstery and pressed a gloved hand against the cushion, then lifted it to the light. See the indentation? I nodded. The imprint of his body, yes, but only half of it. I looked again. Holmes was right. The seat bore the unmistakable hollow of one leg crossed over the other, but the right armrest showed signs of regular use, while the left remained undisturbed, the fabrics slightly dusty. If he had sat like that for 3 weeks, both arms would have worn the velvet, Holmes said, but this suggests he was not sitting still for long, at least not initially, which means he was being posed, I ventured, or posing himself, possibly at specific intervals. A ritual performance, repeated and refined, until the final act. I shivered despite the warmth of the room. Holmes, what exactly are we dealing with? He met my gaze, eyes unusually grave. We are dealing with a man who orchestrated his own disappearance through a process older than reason, and cloaked in belief. But belief does not negate motive, Watson, nor does ritual absolve a perpetrator. And I no longer believe Benedict Swain acted alone. A soft knock interrupted us. Mrs. Forbes stood in the doorway, pale and uneasy. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes," she said, "but I thought you should see this." She held out a folded cloth bundle. Holmes accepted it and carefully unwrapped it on the desk. Inside lay a series of strange items: a broken chain, a shard of mirror, and a length of white linen creased and faintly stained. "I found them in the laundry cupboard," she said, "behind a false panel. I never go in there, but today I noticed the floorboard had been disturbed." Holmes studied each object in turn, then paused on the shard of mirror. He turned it over, then tilted it toward the window. Carved faintly along the back, just visible in the light, was a single word. "Adsto Latin again," I murmured. "It means I remain." Holmes finished. "Yes, the mirror faces the self. The message is meant for the one who looks in." He laid the shard down gently. "Someone has gone to great lengths to create the illusion of a vanishing act. But illusions require planning, concealment, and above all knowledge of the audience." He turned to me. "Tonight, Watson, we do not search the woods. We stay indoors. For I believe the answer is not in what has left this house, but in what has stayed behind." Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The night fell with unnatural swiftness. One moment, the windows still glowed faintly with the overcast winter light. The next, darkness had seeped in like ink poured over the glass. I lit the oil lamps myself, checking each wick twice, aware of the odd pressure in the air as though the house, or something within it, had begun to listen more keenly than before. Holmes had withdrawn into the study again, but unlike his usual bursts of energetic deduction, this time he did not speak. He sat in the corner armchair with the leather-bound notebook in his lap and stared into the cold ashes of the hearth, not reading, not writing, just watching. I left him there and made my way toward the kitchen, where Mrs. Forbes was preparing tea. She moved quietly, her hands shaking slightly as she laid out the cups. "He hasn't eaten, has he?" she asked. Holmes: "No, but he does that often when the case twists on itself." Mrs. Forbes lowered her voice. "Is it true, Dr. Watson, what he said about Mr. Swain not acting alone?" I met her gaze. "It's a possibility. One Holmes intends to confirm." Before long, she swallowed and returned to her tray. "I've worked here nearly 10 years, Doctor. I've never seen anything like what's happening now." Neither had I, though I didn't say it aloud. I had just returned to the hallway with the tray when the front door gave a sharp knock 3 times. Firm and deliberate, I set the tea aside and moved quickly, opening the door onto the crisp darkness. A man stood on the steps, middle-aged, with thinning hair, narrow shoulders, and wire-rimmed spectacles that glinted in the lamplight. He looked startled to see me. "This is the Swain residence, is it not?" he asked. "It is. And you are?" "Arthur Quill. I'm a librarian with the King's College Archives. I came because I'm looking for Benedict Swain." Holmes had appeared behind me without sound. "You're late, Mr. Quill." The librarian blinked. "Pardon by 3 days. I expected someone from your department the moment Swain failed to return the Templewood manuscript. But you've only just arrived." Quill adjusted his spectacles, flustered. "He sent a letter handwritten, which was unlike him. He said he was extending his use of the manuscript due to unforeseen developments." "When did you receive this letter?" 4 days ago, which means it would have been sent approximately 10 days past," Holmes said. "A full week after Mr. Swain fell into his unnatural silence." "I don't understand," Quill said. "Neither did the postal service," Holmes replied, "until I inquired with the local postmistress. The letter was not posted from Chislehurst, but from Southwark." I looked at Holmes sharply. "But that would mean someone forged it," Holmes confirmed. "Someone who had access to Swain's handwriting. Someone who wanted time." Quill stepped back uneasily. "Mr. Holmes, is Benedict Swain missing?" "Vanished," Holmes said. "In plain sight. We invited the librarian in, and over tea in the drawing room." Quill elaborated further. "Swain was deeply invested in the Templewood manuscript. It's a syncretic text, heavily fragmented, combining early Christian iconography with Mithraic symbology. He believed it contained references to a lost right of stillness, what he referred to as the inhibition doctrine. Holmes leaned forward. Did he ever mention a figure called Stator? Quill frowned. He did once, said the name had come to him in a dream. I assumed it was a misreading of Stator Hobista, Roman epithet for Jupiter, the stair invoked to keep armies from fleeing. Battle, indeed, Holmes said. But I do not believe Mr. Swain saw Stator as a metaphor. He stood abruptly. Watson, follow me. We left Quill in the drawing room, baffled, and ascended the staircase. Holmes led me past our guest rooms and down the upper hallway toward a locked door I had taken little notice of before. He withdrew the brass key from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a small private chapel. The room was narrow and bare lit, only by the gloom pressing through a stained glass slit. A stone altar stood at the end, flanked by candles that had long since burned down to nubs. On the wall above the altar was another mosaic cruder than the one in the study, but unmistakable. A seated figure at the center, surrounded by kneeling supplicants. All their faces were featureless. Holmes knelt by the altar and lifted a loose tile. Beneath it was a hollow cavity lined with velvet. From it, he drew a shallow silver bowl, tarnished and stained. Ritual libation, he said. Or symbolic. Sacrifice, perhaps both. Holmes, I said cautiously. How far do you think this went? He didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the mosaic, eyes wide but unfocused. I used to believe, he murmured, that every mystery could be solved with logic that no veil could resist the blade of reason. But here, he trailed off. Here, he said, finally, we may be confronting something that mimics reason, but dances just beyond its edge. I watched him carefully. Holmes had grown distant since the arrival of Julian Elcott and the journal. He had not been sleeping, and though his deductions remained sharp, there was a hauntedness behind his precision, now a sense that the case had begun to ensnare him personally. Back in the drawing room, Quill had gone. Mrs. Forbes reported that he had left in silence, offering no farewell. Holmes said nothing, simply returned to the study and sat once more in the armchair, staring again into the hearth. That night, I woke to find my own door slightly ajar. At first, I thought I had left it so, but when I looked down the hallway, I saw Holmes standing at the end of it, facing the stained glass slit in the chapel wall. UNMOVING. Watching, listening, waiting. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory by morning. The mood in the house had shifted. It was not the kind of shift that could be charted in decibels or temperature, but rather a quiet rearrangement of atmosphere, something unseen tightening its grip. Mrs. Forbes moved about the kitchen with the mechanical care of one preparing a last meal. Ridley sat by the window with a book open on his lap, though he had not turned a page in nearly an hour, and Holmes had returned. Not the statue I had glimpsed in the hallway that night, but the Holmes of clarity, calculation, and controlled purpose. There was a subtle change in his carriage, his movements, still deliberate, but threaded with something quieter, more inward, not confidence, not yet, but a kind of grim anticipation. Watson, he said, as we took our morning tea in the sitting room, today we shall smoke the fox from its den. He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out across the frost-covered lawn where thin tracks, now nearly vanished, marked the paths we had trodden in vain. I have watched, he said, and I have listened. Now, I shall speak. He turned to me. I want you to remain close today, but say nothing unless addressed directly. I intend to draw certain responses, reactions, that must be pure, unguarded. You will know them when you see them. Reactions from whom? All of them, Holmes replied. We no longer need to question who entered the study. We must determine who did not enter, because they never had to. Shortly before noon, Holmes requested the presence of all parties in the drawing room, Ridley, Mrs. Forbes, and Julian Elcott, who had returned that morning with the uneasy air of a man uncertain whether he was guest or suspect. Let us begin, Holmes said, taking up his favored position by the hearth. There has been a great deal of speculation about Mr. Swain's disappearance, some of it credible, some of it colored by fear or imagination. But the time for ambiguity is at an end. He paced slowly before them. We know that Benedict Swain was engaged in something, call it research, call it ritual, that required secrecy. We know he withdrew into a state that mimicked death, and we know that someone sought to conceal the timeline of this transformation. He turned suddenly to Ridley. You claim you left the house the night you witnessed his trance, but did you lock the study door behind you? Aye. I believe so. You believe so. And yet the door remained locked until I opened it with the key from Swain's person still around his neck. At the time, Holmes looked to Elcott. Mr. Elcott, your visit coincided with the time Ridley claims to have seen the ritual, and yet you say you did not see Ridley at all. Elcott nodded hesitantly. I arrived through the garden path. I never entered through the front. Curious, Holmes said, that two men could occupy the same house without crossing paths. He turned at last to Mrs. Forbes. You've been loyal to Mr. Swain for nearly a decade. Did he ever speak to you of Stater? She shook her head. No, never. I heard the name only from Mr. Elcott. Holmes folded his hands behind his back. And yet the laundry cupboard where you found the hidden items, the false panel that revealed the broken chain and mirror shard is not accessible from the guest wing, nor from the study, only from your own quarters. Mrs. Forbes paled. Are you accusing me? I am questioning, Holmes said evenly, and watching, because, you see, what matters now is not who lied about visiting the study, but who needed no access to it to complete the illusion. He pulled from his coat the silver bowl found in the altar chamber. This was not placed there by Swain. He would never have hidden it under an altar whose lock was broken from the outside. Someone concealed this after the fact, someone who feared what might be discovered. Ridley stood abruptly. This is madness. Is it? Holmes asked. Or is it precision? Because last night, as I stood in the upper hallway, I noticed something else. A sound barely audible. A clicking, regular and faint, like the ticking of a clock. But there are no clocks in the chapel. He reached into his waistcoat and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. Unwrapping it, he revealed a brass metronome, its pendulum stilled. This was hidden beneath the altar floorboards, set to a slow rhythm, barely perceptible. He looked to us all. What does a metronome do, Watson? It paces time, I answered. Indeed, or in this case, stillness. A tool not for chaos, but for control. He stepped forward, placing the device gently on the mantel. Someone orchestrated Swain's condition, whether through suggestion, substance, or fear, I cannot yet say. But the aim was not merely to unmake him, was to replace him. Replace him, Elcott echoed. Holmes nodded. Yes, and to do so, the replacement must inherit not only his silence, but his belief. He drew a deep breath. And so I tested a theory. He walked to the study door, opened it, and gestured. A figure stepped into the room. It was Benedict Swain, or so it seemed. The same beard, the same robes, the same distant stare. But something was wrong. He was too alert, too aware. Holmes did not look at him. Instead, he said, Dr. Swain has returned. But I ask you who here will look him in the eye and say they believe it. Silence. Then Julian Elcott stepped forward. His hands trembled. That's not him, he whispered. That's not the man I knew. Holmes turned. Thank you, Mr. Elcott. That is all I needed. With that, the figure turned silently and exited the room. I looked at Holmes in astonishment. Who what? A double, he said. Hired from a small theatre company in Gravesend. Paid to remain silent and stare. It's remarkable what illusion can do with silence and suggestion. He looked at each of the three once more. And now we know who responded. And how. He stepped past me, and soon we shall know why. Chapter 9. A second attempt. Night returned to Chislehurst with an air of unfinished business. Holmes' theatrical gambit with the double had fractured the veil of calm that had, until now, bound the inhabitants of the Swain estate in mutual silence. Elcott had retired early, visibly shaken by his own reaction. Ridley remained near the fire, feigning detachment but casting frequent glances toward the hallway. Mrs. Forbes busied herself with the silver, though I caught her once standing at the foot of the staircase, staring upward with a look I could not decipher, half fear, half recognition. Holmes, as was his wont, seemed simultaneously present and distant. He took his supper in the study, made no comment when I offered him the chair by the fire, and answered questions with nothing more than a tilt of the head or a murmured HMA. His eyes, however, were bright, too bright. They burned with the light of a mind that had moved beyond doubt and now hungered for confirmation. We retired shortly after 10. I left my revolver on the nightstand, out of habit more than foreboding. Holmes had said little before disappearing into his chamber at the end of the hall, but something in his posture told me the game had entered its final movements. It was not the wind that woke me, it was the sound of the latch clicking. I sat up at once, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The air was still, too still, and yet I could hear soft footfalls, precisely measured, moving across the floorboards outside my room. I rose, moved silently to the door, and eased it open. The hallway was empty, but ahead just past the bend that led to the servants' staircase caught a flicker of motion. I followed, my steps careful, heart thudding with slow precision. As I rounded the corner, I saw the narrow door that led to the lower pantry standing ajar, and something inside moved. I pressed forward and pushed the door open. The pantry was in disarray. The shelves had been disturbed, glass jars shattered. On the floor, a trail of dry tea leaves scattered across the stone tiles like a trail of ash. And at the far end, crouched in the corner, was Mrs. Forbes. She was clutching her arm, which bled from a ragged tear across the sleeve. Her eyes were wide and unfocused. "Mrs. Forbes," I said, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" She blinked, as if waking from a trance. I don't know. I came down to check the stores. I thought I heard someone moving in the hall. Then someone was behind me. Hands cold, they grabbed for my mouth. I helped her to her feet. "Did you see who it was?" She shook her head. "A cloak, a mask maybe." I couldn't breathe. I led her back upstairs and called for Holmes. He arrived within moments, fully dressed, eyes sharper than I'd seen in days. He examined the wound with clinical detachment, then turned to me. "Someone tried to silence her, and very nearly succeeded." "Then it wasn't just fear," I said. "There's someone here who's truly dangerous." "There always was," Holmes murmured. "But now they know I know." He turned to Mrs. Forbes. "Did anything strike you, anything at all? A scent, a sound?" She hesitated. "Yes, it was strange. I smelled something like oranges, or bitter flowers. I couldn't place it." Holmes nodded slowly. Oil of neroli used to mask other scents, popular in Roman funerary rites and in some modern perfumes. He turned to me. "Wake Elcott and Ridley. We'll gather in the drawing room. The time for shadow play is over." Within the hour, we were all assembled once more, though this time the fire remained unlit, the room lit only by 3 oil lamps casting pale circles against the darkened walls. Holmes stood by the desk, hands behind his back, eyes flicking from one face to the next. "We are past pretenses," he said. "Someone in this house has attempted to silence a witness. That someone either wears a mask or has become one." He turned to Ridley. "Mr. Ridley, where were you between 10 and 10:30 this evening?" "In my room, reading, alone." "And you, Mr. Elcott?" Elcott looked uncertain. I was in the chapel." Holmes raised a brow. "Why?" "I can't explain. I just felt drawn there. I thought maybe I could understand what he was trying to do." "You entered alone?" "Yes." "Did you touch anything?" Elcott flushed. "Only the altar." Holmes stepped forward. "You touched the altar with your bare hands?" "Yes." Holmes moved to the desk and picked up the silver bowl. With a cloth, he rubbed the inside lip, then held it toward Elcott. A faint smear of blood ran along the rim. "Yours?" Holmes asked. Elcott paled. I cut my finger earlier, on a broken dish." Holmes held his gaze. "And you didn't think to mention it?" Elcott looked away. "You're being led," Holmes said softly. "Whether by belief or fear, I do not yet know. But belief, when it curdles, becomes submission." He turned to Ridley. "And you? Still no memories of leaving your room? No sense clinging to your coat?" Ridley's expression hardened. "This is absurd." Holmes leaned in. "Then tell me why the page missing from Swain's journal, the page describing the invocation of stillness, was found beneath your mattress." Ridley froze. "What? You should have burned it. Instead, you hid it. And in doing so, you betrayed not only your fear, but your complicity." Ridley bolted for the door. Holmes was faster. In an instant, he had intercepted the solicitor, wrenching his arm behind his back with practiced efficiency. I stepped forward, revolver drawn, but it wasn't needed. Ridley sagged under Holmes' grip. "You don't understand," he gasped. "He made me believe. He told me if I stayed still, if I followed the right side, could become like him." Holmes released him, letting him drop into the chair like a marionette with cut strings. "I do understand," he said. "You weren't trying to harm Swain. You were trying to become him." A silence fell, heavy and absolute. Then Holmes turned to me. "We will keep a watch tonight," he said. "No one is to be left alone, not even me." I nodded, but I could not shake the feeling that it was already too late. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The house did not sleep. By Holmes' instruction, each member of the household remained in the main quarters, with the doors to the drawing room and parlour left wide open. A fire was rekindled, not for warmth, but to serve as a symbolic hearth central, visible, undeniable. Ridley had been placed under informal guard, though he seemed more dazed than dangerous now, slumped in an armchair with vacant eyes and a dry mouth muttering half-formed phrases about becoming and purity. Through silence, Holmes, however, remained alert to alert. His gaze moved constantly from one corner to the next, eyes flicking across shadows like a man expecting them to move of their own accord. He had not yet spoken of what truly disturbed him, but I could see it in his posture, the slight hunch of the shoulders, the way he touched his fingertips together, again and again, as if tuning some invisible instrument that refused to play. In key, shortly after 3 in the morning, Holmes rose abruptly and retrieved Swain's journal from his coat pocket. He turned through its pages slowly, murmuring Latin under his breath. Stater mane in tenebris, ad stans inter transitum, et quietum. I translated aloud. Stater remains in the darkness, standing between passage and stillness. Holmes nodded without looking up. Not a warning, a description. Elkhart leaned forward, eyes rimmed red with fatigue. You think Swain believed this being, this Stater, actually existed? I think, Holmes replied, that Swain didn't merely believe it, he sought it. I frowned. For what purpose? Holmes closed the book gently. To preserve something, or perhaps to contain it. His writings shift near the end. The entries become less theoretical and more instructional. He stopped analyzing the rites and began preparing to enact them, but not for transformation. He stood and crossed to the study door, gesturing for me to follow. Come, Watson, there's something I've delayed too long, something I didn't want to believe mattered. We returned to the study, the fire still burning low in the grate, the waxen remains of the ritual candle like a gnarled root across the hearth tiles. Holmes moved to the bookcase and knelt beside the baseboard. Here, he said, tapping twice. This section of the shelf is false. With delicate fingers, he pressed along the grain of the wood. A soft click followed, and a small compartment slid open. Inside was a scroll, not parchment, not paper, but something older, the texture of preserved hide. Symbols had been etched into the surface in concentric spirals. The ink, blackened with age and lined in silver. Holmes unrolled it across the floor. Good Lord, I whispered. Is that it's not a modern fabrication? Holmes confirmed, and not entirely Roman. The symbology is layered Mithric on the outer bands, Christian mystic in the center. But hear this, he said, pointing to the innermost circle. This is something else. What does it say? Holmes translated slowly. The still one stands. The speaker forgets. The gate remains when the body does not. We were silent. He looked at me. Swain believed in Stater not as a deity, but as a principle, a constant, a presence one could invite by eliminating all motion, all speech, all will. He did not seek transformation. He sought to hold something back. I knelt beside the scroll. A gate. Holmes. Yes, a metaphysical barrier between what and what, we cannot know. But Swain must have discovered something, perhaps in the Templewood manuscript, perhaps in this very house. And when he did, he began designing a ritual of containment. Then he vanished because the containment failed. Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he stood, and with a sudden movement, struck the wall with the back of his hand. Dust rose, and, from behind the wall, came a sound. It was faint, not footsteps, not voices. It was breathing, deliberate, slow. Holmes stepped back. Watson, get Elkhart. I hurried to the drawing room, where Elkhart sat half-dozing near the fire. He blinked at me with confusion, then rose when I said Holmes required him. We returned to the study, where Holmes now stood beside the mosaic on the wall, the same one we had studied earlier, depicting the central seated figure and the ring of faceless acolytes. Mr. Elkhart, Holmes said, do you recall how this panel struck you when you first saw it? Elkhart nodded. It reminded me of something. A relief in the Mithraeum beneath the London Wall. Similar structure, similar arrangement of figures. But this one is reversed. Reversed, Holmes echoed. Yes, and what happens when a symbol is reversed? It becomes a seal. Holmes reached into the fireplace and retrieved the iron poker. With the tip, he tapped 3 points along the edge of the mosaic stone, hollow, with precise motion. He inserted the poker into the crack and twisted. The panel groaned and began to shift. Behind it was a chamber, a narrow space, perhaps no more than 10 feet deep, lined with crude shelving and candle stubs melted into the floor. And at the center, frozen in the dimness, one arm outstretched, as if reaching toward something just out of sight, stood Benedict Swain. Alive. Eyes open, mouth closed. Breathing. Holmes didn't move. Neither did I. Neither did Swain. Holmes whispered. He did it. He became the seal. The silence that followed was not empty. It was listening. Chapter 11. The bait. Benedict Swain did not speak. He did not move, save for the steady rise and fall of his chest, a rhythm too measured to be natural and too human to be purely symbolic. He stood within the chamber behind the mosaic, as though rooted, neither awake nor asleep, as if suspended in a dream preserved by stone and silence. His eyes, unblinking, were fixed on a point in the darkness none of us could see. We did not disturb him. Holmes stepped back slowly, drawing the false panel back into place. The stone groaned softly as it returned to its resting frame, as though reluctant to sever us from the strange stillness inside. I suspected, he murmured, but I did not believe until now. We stood in silence for a moment longer. Even Elcott, whose nerves had been frayed to threads, seemed incapable of speech. At last, Holmes turned away and lit the fire with sudden, deliberate energy. He is alive, I said softly. But for how long? Long enough, Holmes replied, if we act quickly. He turned to Elcott. You said Swain spoke of the convergence. What did you take that to mean? Elcott hesitated. A moment when everything aligned. A threshold. He talked about suspending the body so the mind could hold the door. I didn't understand it. I thought it was metaphor. It never is. With men like Swain, Holmes said. He moved to the desk and began writing swiftly. We must use what remains of his ritual, his stillness, his chamber, his silence to bait the one who tried to inherit his role. Someone who believed in the power but lacked the patience. Someone who interrupted the process. You mean Ridley? I said. Holmes didn't look up. He was a pawn, misled by mystique and flattery. He tried to become something without knowing what that something was. Then who? Holmes finished the letter and sealed it with wax. I am not ready to name them yet, but they are still here. He handed me the letter. This goes to Inspector Gregson. Have him bring 2 minnow, more discreet, and tell him to wait on the edge of the estate until summoned. I nodded and left the room at once. When I returned half an hour later, Holmes had cleared the drawing room. Mrs. Forbes had been sent to her quarters, Ridley confined to the parlor under Elcott's passive guard. Holmes stood by the hearth, the coals behind him painting his silhouette in hues of orange and shadow. We will open the chamber, he said. Not fully, just enough. And we will leave it so. Won't that endanger Swain? Holmes shook his head. He is the gate. He knows what must not cross. What we must do is tempt the one who seeks to pass. He moved quickly now, his energy rising. Together, we returned to the study, where Holmes reopened the panel just a hand's width enough for the cool, dry breath of the chamber to spill into the room like a whisper. Swain remained as he had been, unmoved and eternal. Holmes arranged 3 objects near the hearth, the silver bowl, the metronome, and the torn page from the journal that Ridley had hidden. He placed them with meticulous care. This is what they want, he said. The ritual, the rhythm, and the knowledge. He dimmed the lamps until only the fire illuminated the room. Then he gestured to the shadows near the doorway. We wait, here, and we do not speak. The house was quiet for an hour. Then 2 footsteps echoed, once Elcott checking on us. Perhaps. Then nothing. But in the 3rd hour, something shifted. Not a sound, not a movement, a pressure. Holmes tensed beside me. I felt it too, a subtle distortion in the air, like the moment before a storm when the world holds its breath. Then, movement. A figure slipped into the room, cloaked and hooded face, obscured beneath a half-mask painted with concentric circles. Not Ridley. Too tall, too slender. The figure moved with practiced ease, crouching beside the fireplace. Holmes did not move. The figure reached for the silver bowl, ran fingers along its rim, then lifted the metronome. A click echoed as the pendulum began to swing. Tick, tick. Then they turned to the panel. They placed a hand on the edge, whispered something I could not hear, and the stone slid further open. Holmes stepped forward in silence. The figure rose, startled, but it was too late. In an instant, Holmes had grabbed the mask and tore it free. Julian Elcott stood before us. His face was pale, eyes wide but not with guilt, with joy. "You don't understand," he breathed. "I didn't come to harm him. I came to complete it. He called me Holmes. He chose me. I was meant to follow." Holmes stepped between him and the chamber. "You were never meant to follow," he said coldly. "You were meant to witness." Elcott's hands shook. "I was faithful. I waited. I kept the rhythms. I offered silence. But Ridley interfered. He forced it early. I only wanted to restore the balance." Holmes said nothing. From behind us, the chamber sighed. And Swain blinked. It was just once, but it was enough. Elcott saw it. He sank to his knees. "I heard him," he whispered. "Even now, I hear him." Holmes turned to me. "Send for Gregson, now." As I left the room, I looked back once. Swain stood in the stone cell, no longer rigid. His lips moved, but no sound came, only silence. A silence that spoke. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. The following hours passed in a strange, weightless quiet. Inspector Gregson arrived just after dawn with 2 men, as instructed. He was no stranger to Holmes' more unusual cases, but even he betrayed signs of unease as he entered the study and took in the sight of the concealed chamber, the figure of Benedict Swain within, and the young academic Julian Elcott kneeling at the hearth, head bowed in something between surrender and devotion. "This is a fine mess," Gregson muttered. "But no corpse, no weapon, no blood. What do you expect me to charge the boy with?" Holmes stood with one hand on the mantel, gazing into the flame. "Not murder, Gregson, nor attempted murder. If anything, it is a matter for a magistrate and a physician." Gregson grunted. "And the man in the wall? He is recovering," Holmes said, "though what precisely he is recovering from, I hesitate to define. He needs rest, observation, and absolute silence. I have already sent for a private physician in Bromley with the necessary discretion." Gregson crossed his arms. "So the real villain escapes?" Holmes turned. "No, Inspector. The real villain remains." Gregson looked confused, but I knew that Ton knew it as well as I knew the weight of Holmes' footsteps on our stairs. At Baker Street. That was the voice of a man who had seen the pattern behind the tapestry. I followed Holmes as he stepped into the drawing room, where Ridley sat hunched in the corner, chain-smoking and trembling. He looked up as we entered. "You've made your arrest, haven't you?" he rasped. The boy confessed. "What more do you want from me?" Holmes regarded him with the expression of a man who has walked through the wreckage of someone else's illusion. "Everything," he said. Ridley blinked. "I already told you what I knew." "No," Holmes said. "You told me what you thought would exonerate you. You left out the most important truth, not because you wished to conceal a crime, but because it threatened your entire understanding of your role in this." Holmes knelt beside him. "You were not duped by Swain. You were flattered by him. He let you believe you were part of something secret, sacred. He allowed your vanity to fill in the blanks he left. But the one thing you never asked was the simplest of all. Why you?" Ridley looked away. "Because he said." He said nothing. Holmes snapped. "Because you were never meant to carry the ritual forward. Elcott was." Ridley's breath caught. Holmes stood and began to pace. "From the beginning, I could not make sense of the motivations. Why stage a ritual that invites others? Why leave behind clues, symbols, open doors? And then I realized that was the point." He turned to me. "Do you remember the scroll, Watson? The line, 'The gate remains when the body does not.' That was the missing piece." He paced again. "Swain did not wish to vanish. He wished to seal himself, not to escape, but to prevent what he called the crossing. But he knew he could not be alone. The ritual required someone to watch, someone to witness the stillness, to carry the memory of it outward." "Elcott," I said. "Yes, a mind, impressionable enough to believe, but not enough to imitate. He was chosen because he could absorb the mystery but not reproduce it." Holmes looked to Ridley. "But you intruded. You interrupted the ritual too early. Swain wasn't yet at the threshold. And when you saw what you did not understand, you panicked, you fled, you corrupted the process." Ridley began. Holmes silenced him with a gesture. "You thought you could resume it, that by finishing the performance, you could inherit its power. That is why you tried to restore the scene. Why you stole the torn page, lit the wax, used the metronome." He leaned closer. "But you forgot one thing. You are not a believer. You're a lawyer, a man of structure, of terms, of limits. And belief real, Belief real, belief requires surrender. Ridley's face crumpled. I just wanted to be part of something important. Holmes nodded solemnly. And in doing so, you endangered the one man who truly understood what was at stake. He turned to Gregson. You may do as you wish with him, but I suspect he will not contest confinement. Gregson gave a low whistle. This one's above my pay grade. Holmes said nothing. Instead, he returned to the study. I followed. Swain remained in the chamber, seated now on a low stone ledge, his eyes closed. A physician had examined him and found no signs of illness beyond physical exhaustion and profound dehydration. It was as if his body had slowed to a state just shy of dormancy and now was awakening cautiously, as though unsure whether to return. Holmes stood before him and spoke gently. He remembered the one thing none of them did. Stillness is not the absence of motion, it is the presence of choice. Swain opened his eyes slowly. They were pale, sunken, but aware. He nodded once. Is it sealed? Holmes asked. A pause. Then, yes. Holmes exhaled. He turned to me and placed the scroll back in the hidden compartment, resealing it. Elcott will require care, he said, but he is not dangerous. Not any longer. He understands now that he was not meant to carry the burden forward. And Swain? Holmes looked into the fire, thoughtful. He will recover. But I doubt he will ever speak of what he saw on the threshold. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Holmes rested one hand on the mantel. I have solved hundreds of cases, Watson. But this was not a puzzle. It was a warning, and I fear it will not be the last. He turned to me, face grave. Remember this. If you remember nothing else, there are locks that open inward and locks that open out. It is the latter we must guard most carefully. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. By mid-afternoon, the estate had returned to an uneasy calm. Inspector Gregson had taken Ridley into custody, though Holmes had insisted he be kept at the constable station in Chislehurst rather than removed. To London, he won't run, Holmes had said. He has nowhere to run to. Elcott, though deeply shaken, was recovering under supervision in the guest room. Attended by the physician Holmes had summoned. Swain remained behind the sealed mosaic wall, now watched by Mrs. Forbes with a quiet reverence that surpassed duty. I believed the matter nearly resolved, but Holmes did not. He remained in the study well into the evening, seated with his back to the hearth, hands clasped before his lips, eyes focused on a point beyond the visible world. I watched him from the doorway, unwilling to interrupt. When I finally spoke, he answered without turning. It's not finished, Watson. Not yet. I stepped forward. You believe someone else may still act? He nodded slowly. Because someone already has. There is a symmetry to this case. Ritual demands it. There were not merely participants. There were roles. The initiate, the witness, and the gatekeeper. No, the gatekeeper was Swain, but someone else sought to become the warden. The warden. Holmes turned then, eyes sharp. The one who ensures what is sealed stays sealed. The one who watches the watchers. I frowned. And who would that be? Holmes didn't reply. Instead, he stood and moved to the fireplace, withdrawing the silver bowl once more. He set it upon the mantel with exaggerated care, then withdrew a vial from his coat pocket, clear liquid, faintly scented. Narrowly oil, he said. What Mrs. Forbes smelled in the pantry. He uncorked it, dabbed a drop into the bowl, and waited. Nothing happened. Then, a creak. Holmes turned to the door, and so did I. Mrs. Forbes stood there, a tea tray in her hands. Though she made no move to enter, Holmes spoke without looking at her. You kept it far longer than I thought you. Wold. She said nothing. You believed in Swain, but not in the ritual. Not truly. You believed in him as a man, as something to preserve. Her hands trembled slightly, but she remained composed. I saw him disappear, fade, little by little. At first I thought it was age, or melancholy, but then I saw what he was doing, what he was giving up. His body, his words, himself. You thought he was losing himself, Holmes said, but he was not. He was offering himself as a seal. Mrs. Forbes stepped into the room at last, and set the tray down. I told him it would go too far, she said, that if he continued, something might take advantage of the silence he left behind, that something else might speak in his place. Holmes nodded. And so you tried to stop it. I tried to delay it, she corrected softly. Elcott was too eager, Ridley too foolish. But I only wanted time. Holmes moved. slowly to the desk, lifted the corner of the cloth that concealed the scroll. "You stole this once, didn't you? Hid it, then returned it." She didn't answer. "You believed he could be brought back if only he was reminded of himself. That's why you placed the mirror shard in the cupboard. That's why you cleaned the chair in the study. Why you dusted only one side of the mantel. At last," she spoke, "I wanted him to remember he was a man, not a myth." Holmes turned, face unreadable. "But in doing so, you risked undoing what he had nearly completed." She looked at him now. "I didn't mean to hurt him, or anyone." "No," Holmes said quietly. "You meant to keep him here. For yourself." A long silence followed. The air in the study seemed to pulse with the heat of the fire, the tension too close to name. Then the sound of shattering. We rushed into the hallway. A window at the rear of the house had been broken, its iron latch twisted open, glass scattered. Across the stone, and beyond it, footprints. "Running," Elkhart Holmes said. We followed at once, lanterns in hand, through the garden and toward the wood beyond the hedgerow. The prints veered sharply, headed not toward the road or the station, but back toward the stone circle and the iron pedestal that we found him there. Julian Elkhart stood within the circle, arms raised, a candle burning at his feet. He turned as we approached, face wild with exhilaration. "I understand now," he cried. "I wasn't meant to follow Swain. I was meant to replace him." "Elkhart," I said, stepping forward, "you're unwell. Come away from there." But Holmes raised a hand. "No, let him finish." Elkhart lifted the bowl when had he taken it, and poured the neroli oil into the fire. It flared, green and sharp, and then died. He knelt. "I accept it," he whispered. "Take me." Holmes stepped forward, swift and precise, and in one motion scattered the coals with his boot. The circle broke. The fire died. Elkhart collapsed. There was no cry, no scream, only the wind and the sound of breath returning to lungs that had stopped. For just 1 second too long we carried him back to the house. He slept for 2 days without waking. When he rose, he remembered nothing, not of the circle, not of the ritual, not even of Benedict Swain. Holmes said it was a mercy. Perhaps it was. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in by the 3rd day. The air in the estate had changed. Benedict Swain no longer stood in the narrow chamber behind the mosaic. Holmes had moved him gently, with great care, to a quiet upstairs bedroom, where he now lay in bed beneath a woolen blanket, his breathing steady but his mind still remote. He neither spoke nor resisted, but when I entered the room to tend him, I felt the weight of his gaze, watchful even in stillness. Julian Elkhart remained under supervision in the guest quarters. Whatever impulse had driven him into the woods had passed entirely from him now. He seemed dazed, harmless, and ashamed. Holmes had arranged for a specialist in psychological delusions to see him the following week. "The mind may snap back," he'd said to me quietly, "but something often remains in the fibers." Mrs. Forbes, however, was gone. Holmes had watched her walk down the lane the morning after Elkhart's collapse, carrying nothing but a small satchel and the quiet dignity of a woman who had already exiled herself. He made no move to stop her, nor did I. There was nothing more to be said, and yet Holmes was not at rest. He spent most of that final day in the study, not searching, not investigating, but watching. He watched the fireplace, the empty hearth, where so many pieces of the puzzle had first revealed themselves. He watched the desk, the scorched stylus, the ritual bowl, and he watched the mosaic restored now to its original position, sealing once more the chamber behind Dot. At last, near sunset, "He called me in, I believe," he said, "that it is time to explain the final detail." I pulled up a chair. The fire was low, and his voice was quiet, but there was a clarity to it that I had not heard since the earliest days of the case. "From the beginning," he began, "this mystery has centered not around violence, but around intention. No one was murdered. No crime, in the conventional sense, was committed. And yet we are left with a trail of shattered minds, broken beliefs, and a man who tried to hold back something with nothing more than stillness." He tapped the edge of the desk, but there was one detail that never quite fit, one inconsistency that resisted every shape I tried to place it in. "What was it?" I asked. He looked up at me. "The mirror shard." I frowned. "The one hidden in the laundry cupboard?" "Yes. It was found near the broken chain and the stained clothed objects tied to the ritual. We assumed it was part of the mysticism, a relic, perhaps something symbolic. But we were wrong." He crossed the room and opened a drawer. From it, he drew out the shard wrapped in its cloth, still bearing the faint etched word, Adsto. I remain, I said aloud. He nodded. But Watson, who was it addressed to? I opened my mouth, then closed it. Holmes turned the shard slowly in the light. It was not a message from Swain to himself, nor from Elkhart, nor Ridley. It was a message from someone who had already been erased from the story. I stared at the glass dot. Mrs. Forbes. She was the first to find him, Holmes said. The first to witness the stillness. Long before Ridley, before Elkhart, perhaps even before Swain was aware of what he had become. She stood before him day after day and saw the transformation, and it terrified her, not because it was unnatural, but because it was working. I remembered her voice in the kitchen. He stopped being himself. She tried to pull him back, Holmes said. To interrupt the process, she thought by breaking the mirror, hiding the objects, smudging the symbols, she could weaken the seal. She succeeded, I said slowly, at least partially. It allowed the corruption to slip in. It allowed Elkhart's obsession to take root. Holmes nodded. She didn't act out of malice. She acted out of grief. She saw the man she knew disappearing, becoming a vessel for something she couldn't comprehend. And so she left the message, hidden in the one place only she had access to. I remain. He wrapped the shard again and replaced it in the drawer. She was the warden, he said, and she failed. There was silence between us. What now? I asked finally. Holmes stood slowly and turned to the hearth. Now, we do what Swain tried to do. We complete the silence. He walked to the mosaic and placed one palm flat against its center. This house must be closed. The study sealed. The objects returned to the stone. No visitors, no inquiries. I'll speak to Gregson. He'll see to the paperwork. And Swain must never attempt the ritual again. His purpose has been fulfilled. The gate is closed for now. It would be unwise to test it again. I looked at him, truly looked. There was no triumph in his eyes, only weariness. This has shaken you, I said. Holmes did not answer at first. Then, very quietly, I have seen many minds unraveled by illusion, by greed, by fear. But this was a case of belief, not in gods, but in patterns, in meaning, in silence itself. And I fear we are poorly equipped, Watson, for mysteries that resist being solved. He turned from the hearth. Come, we must go. He left the room. I lingered, for just a moment more, watching the faint outline of the mosaic in the dying firelight, and then I, too, turned and walked away. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The weather broke on the morning of the final day. What had been a week of frost and grey stillness gave way to a thin light, cold but clean, filtering across the fields beyond the estate. The change in the air was almost imperceptible, but I sensed it as I walked through the corridors of the house. No longer did the shadows seem to press in from the corners. No longer did the silence feel oppressive. Whatever had passed through this place, whatever had tried to take root, was withdrawing, leaving only the tremor of memory in its wake. Holmes had requested a final gathering, not to confront, accuse, or interrogate, but to mark the closing of something that could not be named aloud. At precisely noon, those who remained convened in the drawing room. Julian Elkhart sat nearest the window, his eyes clearer now though, marked by a new humility. He had not asked for forgiveness, nor had he tried to explain away his actions. He simply listened. Ridley, having been released on Holmes' recommendation with no charges pressed, stood near the fireplace, hands clasped tightly behind his back. His pride had been gutted. He seemed smaller, quieter, uncertain even in his own body. Mrs. Forbes was absent, and Holmes had made no mention of trying to find her. Swain did not appear. He remained in his room, recovering in ways we could neither measure nor understand. Holmes stood, as he always did, at the center of it all, not in command, not as master of ceremony but as witness. I have brought you together, he said quietly, because there is nothing more to pursue. The others stirred slightly, puzzled. No one will be punished. No one will be exonerated. There is no villain left to unveil, and no crime that can be passed by legal terms. The ritual has ended not in success or failure, but in exhaustion. And so now we speak, not to reveal, but to remember. He paused, then addressed them each in turn. Mr. Elkhart, you were chosen to witness what most would never believe. You mistook the invitation for a command, and belief became ambition. But belief, if it is not anchored, becomes contagion. You must not forget what you saw, but neither must you carry it alone. Let it be memory, not longing." Elcott bowed, his head, a single tear sliding down his cheek. "Mr. Ridley," Holmes continued, "you sought meaning where you were never meant to find it. You thought you could claim a place in something older than your understanding. But meaning is not granted to those who sit, it is offered to those who wait. You have not failed, you have simply been returned to the beginning." Ridley said nothing, but his lips moved in a silent nod. Holmes turned toward the fire. "This house," he said, "stood as a threshold, not to another world, perhaps, but to another understanding." Swain built his silence, not as a retreat, but as a fortress. He believed something waited beyond motion, beyond speech, and in holding that silence, he held something back. He reached into his coat and withdrew the mirror shard one final time. He held it up so the firelight caught the etched word, "Adst, remain," Holmes said aloud. Then he set the shard on the mantel. "You each remain," he added, "to carry this forward, not as ritual, not as doctrine, but as a warning." He looked to me, "And so do we." There was no applause, no closure. The fire continued to crackle. The world outside continued to turn. But something had changed. Nonetheless, something final had passed between us. Holmes stepped back from the hearth. "I have arranged for the estate to be placed under caretaker supervision," he said. "The study and the chamber behind the mosaic will be sealed. Its contents inventoried but not disturbed. Swain has declined to leave a will. I believe that is intentional." "What will happen to him?" Elcott asked. "He will recover, in time," Holmes replied. "But I suspect he will not speak of this again, nor should you." He turned then, and the others understood that it was time to go. One by one, they left. Ridley first, then Elcott, who paused at the threshold as if to say something, then thought better of it, and departed in silence. Holmes and I were alone. He walked to the window, looking out at the bare trees, their limbs etched against the pale sky. "You've seen many things, Watson," he said, "but this was different." "Yes," I replied. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you believe in it, in what Swain did?" I considered my answer. "I believe that what we carry inside us matters. That silence can be more than absence. That belief, real belief, reshapes the one who holds it." Holmes nodded. "That will do." He turned from the window. "Come, Watson, there's nothing more to learn here." We walked through the front hall together, down the steps, and into the cold sunlight. And behind us, the house remained, not haunted, not cursed, just silent and still. Chapter 16. The reveal. We returned to Baker Street just after dusk. The sky over London layered in violet and soot, the city shrugging itself into another cold night. It had been a long journey back from Chislehurst, made longer by the silence. Holmes maintained throughout. He kept to his corner of the carriage, one leg crossed neatly over the other, his fingers tented at his lips, eyes half-lidded, not asleep, but sunk into a deep, interior solitude. It was only as the familiar facade of 2-1B came into view that I saw the lines at the corner of his mouth soften, as though something in him, taut for too long, had begun to yield. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual quiet concern. I took her aside to assure her there were no corpses this time. No scandal, no urgent telegrams or cryptic chemical stains to be scrubbed from the woodwork. Just a man and a mystery, both weary, and both returned. That evening, we sat again in our old chairs, the fire glowed low in the grate, and the sound of carriages hummed like distant surf beyond the windows. Holmes lit his pipe, leaned back, and looked at me for the first time with the directness of a man ready to speak, not as a detective, but as a witness. "Now, Watson," he said. "You've waited patiently. Shall I take you through it?" I closed my journal, nodded once. "Start from the beginning." Holmes exhaled, and the smoke rose like a ribbon above his brow. When Ridley first came to us, he framed the situation as one of mental illness, a man retreating from the world, unresponsive, yet alive. It appeared innocuous. But the moment he used the phrase "waiting for something," I knew we were dealing with something other than madness. Madness is chaotic. This was deliberate. He tapped ash into the tray. Swain's condition was neither psychosis nor catatonia. It was an act, but not of deception, of intention. He was enacting a ritual, a methodical disconnection of self from body. Not to vanish, but to hold. To hold what? I asked. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the fire. The scroll, remember. It layered in symbols from multiple traditions. It was not a religious artifact. It was a design, a blueprint for containment. Swain believed he had identified a metaphysical locus, a point in the mind where belief and silence intersect to resist invasion. Invasion, I echoed, of thought, of will, perhaps even of something older, I cannot say, but he feared. What might pass through a man who no longer occupied himself? I frowned, and Ridley. Holmes nodded. Ah, yes, Ridley. He wasn't malicious, Watson, just vain. He saw Swain's retreat, and thought it a challenge. He fancied himself an actor, but when he witnessed the ritual firsthand, and saw the transformation begin, true, irreversible transformation, he panicked. Rather than call for help, he tried to reverse it, by disrupting the process. Precisely, he burned part of the text, hid the ritual objects, attempted to reset the stage, so to speak. But in doing so, he left a gap, an imperfect seal. That's when Elkhart stepped in. I remembered the night we had followed Elkhart into the woods. His voice, his face lit by firelight. That terrible conviction. Elkhart, Holmes continued, was not chosen for his strength, but for his receptivity. He was meant to observe, not act. But the gap Ridley created allowed belief to mutate into ambition. Elkhart began to interpret the silence, not as containment, but as transcendence. He wanted to finish what Swain started. And Mrs. Forbes, I asked. Holmes leaned forward. She was the axis of it all. She saw everything, knew Swain before his withdrawal, understood the man behind the myth, and when he began to disappear into the ritual, she resisted not with words, but with actions. She broke the mirror. She placed the linen in the cupboard, left the message, Adsto, I remain, to remind him of himself. Yes, but in doing so, she destabilized the most crucial element of the right consistency. Silence without conflict. A container without stress. She introduced grief into the formula. Grief, Watson, is the most human defiance of stillness. It stains everything. He paused, puffed once more at the pipe, then continued. She tried to protect him, but protection born of love can be as disruptive as betrayal. That's what let Elkhart's obsession take hold. I considered this in silence. So it wasn't evil, any of it. Holmes shook his head. No, just devotion, misdirected. Love that wanted to preserve, fear that wanted to possess, faith that wanted to ascend. He turned toward the window. The gas lamps outside had come alight, their reflections dancing on the pane like ghostly flames. The chamber behind the mosaic, he said, was never meant to be a tomb. It was a barricade. Swain offered himself not to die, but to stop something else from living through him. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. And that thing is still sealed. For now, Holmes said. But the seal is not eternal. It was held by a man's will, and when that will falters, so too will the silence. He looked at me then. You asked me once, long ago, whether I believed in the supernatural. I told you no, that I believed in reason, in deduction. He smiled, faintly, and I still do. But now, I also believe that there are things which exist just beyond the reach of both things we cannot solve, only observe. He leaned back, his silhouette cast long against the hearth. I did not defeat a killer in Chislehurst, Watson. I bore witness to a man holding back the tide, and I helped him let go without drowning. I said nothing for a long while. Then, I reached for my pen, opened my journal once more, and wrote the only line I could. Sherlock Holmes had solved the case. But for once, the solution was not to understand the crime, but to understand the silence. Chapter 17. Outcome and justice. In the days that followed, the case of Benedict Swain slipped quietly out of the public eye. There were no headlines in the Times, no scandalous sketches in the Penny Illustrated, and no triumphant declarations from Scotland Yard. Inspector Gregson filed a short and vague report that spoke only of mental strain, academic obsession, and a near-tragic breakdown in judgment among colleagues. No names were mentioned, no charges were pressed. That Holmes had ensured .elcott was placed under the care of a discreet institution just outside Canterbury, one known for its treatment of cases where belief and trauma intertwine. The physicians reported slow, steady improvement. He had taken up gardening. He had stopped speaking Latin in his sleep. Ridley, shamed but free, returned to London and resumed his legal practice under a cloud of personal disgrace. Holmes had warned me not to expect public remorse. A man like Ridley, he said, does not repent, he redirects, but his ambition will never again find a ritual to cling to. As for Mrs. Forbes, she had vanished, as if into mist. No forwarding address, no formal resignation. The last the village postmistress had seen of her. She had boarded a coach with nothing but her satchel and a black cloak against the wind. Holmes left no instruction to pursue her. She did what she thought was right, he told me, and then she let it go. That's more than most people ever do. Benedict Swain recovered slowly. The physician Holmes had sent to him a tall, watchful man named Dr. Emery Zent. Weekly updates, each more optimistic than the last. Swain had regained speech in fragments. He had begun to eat without prompting. Most interesting of all, he had resumed writing, but not in Latin, not in any language the world recognized. When I asked Holmes about it, he only said, "Let him speak what he must, so long as the silence holds." We were back at Baker Street. When the final correspondence arrived, a single envelope, heavy with the weight of thick vellum. The seal was unmarked. Inside was a sheet of paper, carefully folded, bearing only one line of script in Swain's unmistakable hand. Nanapiria's Iterum. Do not open again. Holmes read it twice, then burned the letter without a word. That night, I found him, staring into the fireplace, his brow drawn and pensive. I sat across from him in silence, waiting for whatever thought stirred behind his eyes to rise to the surface. At last, he spoke. "There is a kind of justice in the world, Watson, that does not involve courts or constables." He gestured toward the fire. What happened in that house was not a violation of law, but of meaning, a disturbance not of morality, but of balance. And the people who caused it, whether through ignorance or faith, have paid in full measure. I nodded. But the truth, the real truth, no one else will know it. Holmes gave me a sideways glance. Isn't that always the case? They see the results. They never see the pattern, but you saw it. He gave a small, dry smile. That's my curse, Watson, and perhaps my advantage. I hesitated before speaking again. Do you believe it's truly over? He tapped the side of his pipe, the motion slow and meditative. I believe the seal is whole. I believe Swain finished what he began, but things like this, they don't end. They simply recede. I felt a chill creep along my spine despite the fire. And what if it comes again? In another form, another place. He looked at me, not with dread, but with a kind of calm inevitability. Then we'll be there. That evening, Holmes filed the final papers, away under an innocuous label in our index, the Swain Silence. Just above it, in smaller handwriting, he added a single note in the margin. Threshold cases see also, the warden's code. He never explained what that meant, and I never asked. The following morning, I walked alone through Regent's Park, my notebook closed in my pocket. I thought about the faces that had passed through this case, the faithful, the ambitious, the misguided, the silent. I thought of how thin the veil had become around that old estate in Zilhurst, how belief, when stretched too far, had begun to bend the very fabric of a man. I wondered what it meant to dedicate oneself not to action, but to inaction, to silence, to becoming still enough that one might serve not as a door but as a lock, and I wondered if I could ever do the same. When I returned, Holmes was already at work on another case, something about a vanished pearl and an absent footman. His mood had lifted. He greeted me with the brisk cheer he reserved for puzzles with clean edges and clear villains. But as he leaned over the desk, making notes in swift angled script, I saw something on the sideboard, an object that hadn't been there before. Mirror shard. Its inscription had been rubbed smooth, erased, and with it perhaps the final message, or perhaps not. Perhaps it was simply no longer needed. Chapter 18. Holmes' final reflections. Some weeks passed before I dared ask Holmes about the case again. He had since returned to his usual rhythm cases of theft and blackmail, disinherited heirs and unfaithful spouses, all resolved with his customary brilliance. But now and again, between the cracks of routine, I caught him pausing just a moment too long beside the fire, or reaching absently for a space on the bookshelf that had never held anything at all. These were not the marks of a haunted man, but of one who had brushed against something outside the domain of reason, and had quietly carried it home. One particularly fog-laden morning in late March, I found Holmes seated by the window of 2-1B, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside him. He was watching the street, not for suspects or signs of movement, but for the city itself, as if it might, at any moment, reveal its hidden pulse. "I suppose," I said, taking my place across from Him, that there are still things even you do not entirely solve. He smiled faintly. On the contrary, Watson, I solved every part of the case, but not every part of the world. I waited. He did not speak again immediately, but instead reached for his pipe, lit it with practiced ease, and let the silence stretch just long enough to settle like dust on the sill. The key, he said finally, was never the ritual, nor the symbols, nor even Swain himself. He looked at me. It was the stillness. I frowned. The stillness was the effect, wasn't it? The result of whatever Swain was doing. Holmes shook his head gently. No, Watson. It was the method. It was the intention. The stillness wasn't an escape. It was an answer. I considered this, and the threat. He exhaled slowly, smoke rising in thin, deliberate strands. We'll never know if there truly was one. Perhaps Swain held back some terrible force beyond comprehension. Or perhaps he merely held back himself, his fears, his doubts, his humanity. Perhaps the threshold he sealed was not cosmic, but internal. He paused, but the consequences were real. People were hurt, not because of what they believed in, but because they tried to control what they could not understand. I nodded. Like Ridley, or Elcott, or even Mrs. Forbes, each of them looked into the silence and saw something different, something they tried to preserve, or shape, or inherit. He gestured toward the hearth. But silence is not a mirror, Watson. It does not reflect, it absorbs, and if you shout into it long enough, it will swallow your voice and leave you empty. He stood, crossed to the bookcase, and adjusted a spine that didn't need adjusting. Then, quite unexpectedly, he turned to me with a look I had only seen once before after the affair of the Musgrove ritual, when he spoke of the ancient house sinking into the soil of England. You always write your accounts so faithfully, he said, but I ask you now, as a friend not as a chronicler, do not publish this one. I blinked. You don't want the story told. I want the silence to remain. His voice was calm, not pleading. There are puzzles for the mind. There are truths for the court. And then there are warnings meant not to be spread, but to be kept. I said nothing for a long moment. Then I nodded. I understand. Holmes gave a slight incline of the head and returned to his chair. Outside, the fog pressed gently against the glass, as if the world beyond were considering entering but had, for now, thought better of it. Later that evening, as Holmes dozed lightly by the fire and the shadows grew long, I took out my notebook and penned a final entry. Not for publication, not even for posterity, just for me. Some cases begin with murder, others with theft, but a rare few begin with silence and end with it. This was such a case. No charges laid, no gallows prepared, no crowds at the Old Bailey. Only a man who sat too still. A man who, by stillness alone, may have held back a darkness we will never name. Sherlock Holmes saw it, understood it, and then, quietly, let it go. And if I ever find myself standing before such a threshold again, I pray I too will have the wisdom to remain still. I closed the notebook. The fire crackled on. Holmes stirred, but did not wake Dart outside. The city whispered in its endless rhythm, and within, all was quiet.